Well, what I want to do is talk about plants a little bit in terms of their key characteristics, many of which you've seen in lab, but also I want to elaborate on a few things that we haven't seen in lab. First of all, what is a plant? Plants share a number of characteristics with green algae. First of all, they're photoautotrophs, meaning they carry out photosynthesis. They have cellulose cell walls. And the other thing they share with at least some green algae is the presence of a life cycle which is called alternation of generations. But the rest of the adaptations that plants have, or characteristics that plants have, relate to life on land. So remember that plants are multicellular eukaryotes, and they have an embryo, which is an immature stage in the life cycle, which is called a sporophyte. And the other thing is that many plants, but not all, have what we call a vascular system, a series of tubes that conduct fluids throughout the plant. And there are two types of vascular tissue. Xylem conducts water and minerals throughout the plant, and phloem conducts water and organic nutrients such as sugars around the plant as well. So not all plants have this vascular system, but many familiar plants do. Also, some plants have seeds, which again is a specialized adaptation related to life on land. So let's start out by looking a little bit at the basic plant life cycle. It's this alternation of generation life cycle. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that the plant in its life cycle goes through two multicellular stages. One is called the gametophyte up here, and the other one is called the sporophyte, which is shown down here in the case of ferns. I'm going to start with the sporophyte because this is the stage that most people are familiar with. When we look at most plants, what you see is going to be sporophyte. So you go outside and you see a tree or a flowering plant or a fern plant. That's basically going to be sporophyte. It is multicellular and it is diploid. Just by the name sporophyte, you can probably guess that it's going to produce spores. The spores are produced by meiosis. So this is a key difference between plants and animals. In animals, the gametes are produced directly by meiosis, but in plants, the product of meiosis are what we call spores. And the spores are real light. They're just single-celled structures that get blown around by the wind. When they land in a suitable area, which usually means an area where that's moist, like a stream bed, a stream bank, for example, they germinate, they undergo mitosis and development, and they develop into what are called gametophytes. And the gametophyte is haploid. It's multicellular and it is haploid, as opposed to the sporophyte, which is diploid. The gametophyte has specialized structures in different parts of the gametophyte that produce sperm and produce eggs. The sperm, in many cases, has to swim through a thin film of water to get to the egg. This is the case in both moss and also in ferns. And it's one of the reasons why both mosses and ferns are so dependent on water. Well, one way or another, the egg gets fertilized and becomes a diploid zygote, which goes through mitosis and development to become a sporophyte again. So the alternation of generations is between the diploid sporophyte and the haploid gametophyte. So you're going to want to spend a little time thinking about this life cycle and seeing how it compares with animals. Let's look at some of the major groups of plants really quickly. First of all, we have mosses and their relatives, which are collectively called bryophytes. And so here's a picture of a branch with a bunch of moss growing on it. I'll be real careful not to confuse moss with what are called lichens. Lichens are something else entirely, as you'll see later on in lab. So what are some key points about mosses and their friends? Well, first of all, bryophytes, mosses, are non-vascular. They don't have seeds. Also, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. By that, what I mean is that that's the stage that carries out photosynthesis. And the sporophyte does not carry out photosynthesis. Again, with bryophytes, the sperm has to swim from one part of the plant to the other to get to the egg for fertilization. Examples are mosses, which you're familiar with, and a group of somewhat distantly related plants which are called liverworts, and they have kind of flat gametophytes, and the sporophytes stick up like little umbrellas. So let's look more closely at what's going on with gametophytes. Here is a typical look at moss. The green fuzzy stuff, that's gametophyte, it's haploid, and the little capsule that's sticking out of the gametophyte, that is basically the sporophyte. Notice that the sporophyte is not green, doesn't carry out photosynthesis, and so it depends entirely on the gametophyte. That's what we mean when we say in mosses the gametophyte is the dominant stage. All right. Next major group of plants are what are called seedless vascular plants, and these include a collection of somewhat different plants. First of all, ferns that you're familiar with. This one over here, which looks a little bit different, is what's called Lycopodium, and it's informally called club moss, but it's not a moss. It is more closely related to ferns. Both these structures that you're seeing here are sporophytes, not gametophytes. This is another fern relative, another seedless vascular plant, and we saw this in lab. This is what's called horsetail. Notice most horsetails don't have leaves. They have these jointed photosynthetic stems. Some of them have little leaves that come off of those. And there's this specialized structure up here where the spores are produced by meiosis. So in seedless vascular plants, you have the vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. When you have vascular tissue, these guys, even though they start out being dependent on water, because the gametophyte is non-vascular, they can grow quite a bit taller than mosses can grow because of the presence of that vascular tissue. So what are some key points about these plants? They have vascular tissue. The sporophyte is the dominant stage in that it is the most obvious stage. Spores are produced by specialized structures on the plant. They're called sori in plural. Ferns still depend on water because the sperm still has to swim from one part of the gametophyte to another or to another gametophyte. Also, the gametophyte is thin and non-vascular, so it's not really good at absorbing water, and that's pretty typical of gametophytes. Also, at one point, these ferns and their relatives formed vast forests that eventually became coal back about 300 million years ago. So we depend on the coal as one of the major sources of fossil fuels. All right. Well, let's get into some more familiar territory. Next major group of plants are what are called gymnosperms. Gymno means naked, sperm here doesn't mean sperm in the way that we normally think about it. It means seed. And the idea is that the seeds are produced on cones. And so here's a typical pine cone. And you can see right here this little what's called a scale, which is actually a highly modified leaf. And right here are two seeds growing on the surface of that scale. Okay? All right, so in gymnosperms, what you see is sporophyte, and gymnosperms produce seeds on cones. So what are some key points? Again, the sporophyte stage is dominant. They have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, and by the way, what we call wood is basically xylem. Obviously, they produce seeds that are, as I mentioned before, produced on the surface of highly modified leaves, and that whole structure is what we call a cone. There are a wide variety of plants that don't necessarily look very much alike that are gymnosperms. For example, conifers, pine trees and their friends, a plant called ginkgo, and then a really interesting group of plants that look a lot like palm trees, at least superficially, what are called cycads, and we'll take a look at some of these. All right, so here's a cedar plant, and close up, And these little blue guys here are actually highly modified cones. There are only one or two scales in the seeds in this structure. But this is not a berry. It actually is a modified pine cone, if you will. Some gymnosperms are really, really big. So here are redwoods in California. And again, these are gymnosperms. Next we have these guys right here. These are ginkgos. Ginkgos go back, I think, about 200 million years ago, and they were almost extinct, but they were rediscovered, I think, during about the 18th century in a monastery, and they've become very important plants for in cities because they're very resistant to pollution. Next, we have cycads. These little palm tree-like guys. Actually, they're pretty good size. They're not pine trees or palm trees. They're actually more closely related to pines. And so this is actually a gymnosperm. These are at Walt Disney World, by the way, and shows how these are very commonly used as landscape plants in warmer climates. Unfortunately, they don't grow here in Kansas. All right. Next major group of plants, the one that we're most familiar with, are what we call flowering plants. And so this opening slide shows a picture of an orchid. And orchids are interesting because they have lots of specialized adaptations for pollination. And strangely enough, they're the most diverse group of flowering plants in terms of numbers of species. So what are some key points about flowering plants? Well, first of all, the way to understand flowering plants is that a flower, again, sporophyte, but a flower is a series of highly modified leaves. The alternation of generation life cycle is still there, but you don't see the gametophyte very often, or you don't see an obvious gametophyte, and instead what you see is basically sporophyte. So what's happened to the gametophyte? Well, first of all, what we call pollen actually happens to be a male gametophyte. Okay, a little tiny gametophyte that produces sperm. At the base of the flower, there's a structure called an ovary, and that's where the female gametophytes are produced. So what's going on here is that in the parts of the flower that are going to produce pollen, well, you get gametes, or rather spores, made by meiosis, but the spores don't go anywhere. They germinate in place. The same thing in the ovary. You get spores produced there, or rather, but the spores don't go anywhere. They germinate and develop into a little gametophyte. Okay? That gametophyte, after fertilization, along with surrounding tissue, becomes the seed. And the seed and the fruit that encloses the seed is an important dispersal package. So the spores anymore are in flowering plants, and also in the gymnosperms, I might add, are no longer the main way of dispersal. Now we have these highly modified structures, what we call seeds.